public murder. One day during the second week of December, Bernie had walked down the 2 flights of stairs to Sheila's apartment after he had returned home from work and had changed into some more casual attire, khaki trousers and a checkered flannel shirt and his comfortable pair of running shoes. These late afternoon visits of his frequently saw him depart from Sheila's door early the next morning after he'd soundlessly slipped out of her bed. After a few light taps on the door, Sheila unlocked it and then let him in. Her appearance at once took him aback. "Sheila, what's the matter?" he said, with mounting concern. "What's going on?" She had been crying, that was obvious. Her eyes were bloodshot and she looked stricken. "I heard some news out of Spokane today, Bernie," she said. She came into the apartment and shut the door. "There was a shooter." "Oh my God, there was a shooter. Jack was there. 2 people are dead, 5 were wounded, and Jack was one of them." She looked at him now in helpless dismay. "Fucking hell," he said in disbelief. "When did all this happen? Is Jack all right? What about Jack? Is he all right?" "No, he's not. On the news they said he was shot once in the shoulder. This asshole stood up in the audience, pulled out a handgun while Jack was doing his routine, and the son of a bitch shot Jack straight off. Oh God, and then he turned and started shooting at the crowd. It must have been horrendous. I've got to see him, Bernie. Jack and I have been friends a long time." Bernie rubbed his forehead, then he took out a pack of cigarettes, shook out 2 of them and gave one to Sheila. He lit them both and said, "I'll call in sick tomorrow. We can drive over to Spokane tomorrow morning." "Oh, Bernie, could you? I'm still not going to be in any shape to drive." "You won't have to worry about that. We'll leave as soon as you like, okay?" Wordlessly, she nodded, then fell into his arms and began to cry. As they came up to the entrance to the room in which Jack was recovering after a bit of surgery, an emergency doctor had performed to first cleanse the internal portion of the wound of debris from the bullet and any bone fragments, then sew up the entry and exit wounds. They saw that he already had 2 visitors, a short older man with a white beard and standing beside him a small Asian woman. Jack saw them immediately. "Hey, Sheila, you came to see me. And there's Bernie, too. Come in, join the party. I want you to meet my 2 good friends here in Spokane, Jordan and Lillian Fisher." The 2 men shook hands and Fisher said, "Our unlucky friend here has the distinction of having been the first person ever shot at the Spokane Comedy Club." "I've already been working on some new jokes about it," Jack said. "It's got to be one of the worst ways to leave the stage." Sheila stepped up to the side of Jack's bed. She now stood next to Lillian Fisher, who glanced at her momentarily with a look of detached regard the Chinese sometimes use when dealing with anyone from the West. "You're such a trooper, Jack," Sheila said. "Nothing can ever keep you down." She took hold of the hand of his uninjured arm, squeezing it now with both concern and affection. And she said, "So, when are you going to be able to break out of this joint?" "Oh, they've told me day after tomorrow. One more day in this godforsaken place just so they can avoid any form of liability." "You are always so cynical," Lillian said. "That's why we love you." "You know me, sweetheart. I'm just a natural-born cynic." As natural-born as they come. After Sheila and Bernie had been visiting with Jack for several minutes while his other 2 Spokane friends, Jordan and Lillian Fisher, looked on quietly, a nurse entered the room with a new bottle for Jack's IV attachment. She first shut off a valve just below the nearly empty bottle, then removed it and put the new one in its place and opened the valve once again. After a moment, she glanced at the others and said, "Mr. Bayfield just received another dose of nocturnamine, which the doctors prescribed to manage the pain. Mr. Bayfield, how are you feeling right now?" "Like I'm on an air mattress floating on the lake. Not bad, actually. That stuff you've been giving me here takes the pain away pretty quick. You're going to send me home with some of that stuff in pill form?" "That would depend on what the doctor thinks when he looks you over tomorrow afternoon," the nurse said. "He should be here between 3 and 4 tomorrow afternoon." As she was saying this, Jack drifted off to sleep. Fisher glanced up from Jack to Bernie and said, "You folks eaten lunch yet? You'd be our guest. Obviously, Jack won't be doing any more talking for a while." "Sure," Sheila said. "We'd love to have lunch with you and Lillian." "Great," Fisher said. He then glanced at his wife and said, "Well, where should we go?" "Well, what about the rid path with their outdoor geodesic enclosures?" she suggested. And then she turned to Sheila and said, "I read about this a few months ago in the paper. There was a photograph showing two of them nearby one another. Each of the domes was completely transparent. They can even be heated if you prefer not to rough it out there in the cold weather." Once they arrived at the rid path, the three of them stood by while Jordan asked, Are those plexiglass domes still in use up there on the roof?" The hostess informed him that no, the domes were no longer being used due to lack of interest. Then she led them into the restaurant, which was half hidden from the alcove by a floor-to-ceiling wine rack, which also served as a partition. After they were seated and a diligent, smiling waiter had soon appeared, Jordan asked the fellow if he wouldn't mind bringing a bottle of Merlot and a bottle of Pinot Grigio, since Lillian preferred white wine, and the obliging waiter quickly returned with both, along with 4 glasses gripped upside down in one hand while holding the pair of bottles by their necks in the other. He then hastened to open each of them. As the waiter was opening the second bottle with his pocket corkscrew, Jordan said, "That's fine, pal. We don't need to taste it first, so we're all set." Fisher then set about pouring the wine, red for the gents and white for the ladies. Once that was done, he raised his glass and said, "To Jack and his quick recovery." After this toast, they fell silent for a moment. Later during their meal, Fisher said, "Except for Lillian, the rest of us have lived in the United States all our lives. We've all seen how gun violence in this country has evolved, growing over the few decades into the rampant, nightmarish situation it has metastasized into today." Jordan has started to seriously consider running against Kathy McMorris Rogers in the next presidential election year, Lillian said, giving her husband a tolerant smile. "I may change my mind and launch out during an off-year election. Challenger may have better odds during an off-year election. I've got to look into it. Also, there's a lot of paperwork involved, documents required by federal law to fill out. If I do get into this, it's going to be nonstop and as grueling and tedious as hell. But I expect I'll manage to get used to it." "Well, if I lived here in Spokane," Sheila said, "I'd volunteer to work on your campaign committee. I'm tempted to run as an independent, along the lines of Angus King from Maine or Bernie Sanders." "If you trimmed that beard of yours down to a mustache," Sheila remarked, "you'd look a bit like Angus King, I think." "Out of all the senators," Bernie said, "King is one of the best." "Who would you say is one of the worst?" Lillian asked. "Oh, I don't know. Cruz, probably, or Rand Paul, or that Kennedy fellow from Mississippi or Alabama or wherever he's from." Bernie and Sheila departed from their new friends after lingering briefly in front of the rid path while saying goodbye. They drove to the Red Lion and checked into the room Sheila had booked, having made a reservation over the phone much earlier that morning before they had driven out of Seattle. Each of them rested separately on either of the two queen-size beds, saying little. Sheila soon fell asleep. Bernie lay upon the other bed and glanced from the ceiling to Sheila when he noticed her breathing had grown deeper and slower and more audible. He'd been circling around and then dwelling upon the thought that the sheer routine of his life, its weekly rhythm, had suddenly been temporarily altered. Further, he kept comparing this minor deviation, this road trip with Sheila to Spokane, from his own weekly routine to the wholesale upending and abrupt halt to Jack's weird 2-month-long cycle. He couldn't imagine living the way Jack did, out of a suitcase, like a traveling minstrel or player of old, decamping from one village as the horses drawing their wagon plodded along to the next little town or hamlet where they could entice some of the citizenry to attend their in-tent performance, small price of a coin or two gaining a person admittance. Times would have been good during autumn, especially after the harvest when everyone had a little extra money to throw around. The role and economic niche of the roving entertainer had been around forever, Bernie thought, continuing his reflections, ever since the time of the ancient bards who played the lute or the lyre and chanted their long epic ballads. And then there's Bob Dylan, Bernie thought. He rose and went to the window and looked down at the Spokane River in the growing afternoon dusk. He thought about leaving the room, going downstairs, then out of the building to walk along the river, the way a few others had been doing earlier when he'd taken a glance out the window for the first time just after stepping into the room. Now, had he been sitting in a lakeside cabin, or kicking back on a sofa in a rustic mountain chateau, for instance, he would hardly have been feeling restless, the desire to merely walk about, getting stronger and more insistent by the moment, as he was experiencing in the hotel room at that very second. He sat up and swung his feet down from the bed and rose and went to the desk and wrote a quick note to Sheila that he'd gone downstairs to the bar. Meet me in the bar downstairs after you're done with your nap. Love you, sweetheart. He wrote on the notepad, leaving it there unremoved. There were about a half a dozen people in the bar, not counting the two stylish honchos in red vests serving drinks. Bernie pulled a stool away from the bar and sat down with an appreciable distance between himself and the man and woman near the office bed. All the others were seated either at a table or a booth. The nearest bartender stepped up across the bar from Bernie and asked him what he wanted to drink. Bernie said he'd have a scotch and soda. As he waited for his drink, he began listening to the conversation underway less than 10 feet distant, the threesome at one of the curved booths. Two men and a woman were talking about the shooting. A moment later, the bartender returned with Bernie's drink. The fellow took a glance at the $10 bill Bernie had removed from his wallet and placed there a moment earlier. "Do you care for anything else, sir?" the bartender asked. "No, this'll do just fine, thanks." "Would you care to start a tab?" "Maybe. I'm waiting for someone. I'll let you know." The bartender nodded with a knowing, though respectful grin, and with a wink swept up the sawbuck and sauntered back to join his confidant and co-worker once again. Bernie sat in rock-like repose, waiting for Sheila, listening involuntarily while wishing it were otherwise to the conversation underway. Waiting for Sheila, listening involuntarily while wishing it were otherwise to the conversation underway near him among the threesome in the booth. The woman was doing most of the talking, and apparently she had met Jack on some earlier occasion. She seemed to know him, it now appeared to Bernie, as he continued to listen. I know you don't believe me, Chet, but I did meet him a while back, about a year ago. You met the comedian who got shot last night? Where'd you meet him? Right there at the comedy club. After the show, he was hitting on me pretty soon, trying to pick me up. I told him that guys who thought they were funny and smart were not my type. No, definitely not your type, said the other man. You should know, Bill, she said in return with a marked and sassy tone of innuendo. But then I guess that makes me dull and stupid, Bill said. Not necessarily, you just happen to be good in bed. Please, said the first man, spare me the details. Will you, you two? I don't need to hear about your wild romp between the sheets. Since when did you become such a grim fucking asshole, huh, Chet? She said. Since the first and hopefully the last time I had the pleasure of listening to a new pair of lovers slobber over each other with their undying affection. You fucking asshole, you're just jealous. Well, one of us was going to lose out, and that turned out to be me. Poor baby. All right, hold on right there, you two, Bill said. I don't want my best friend and my girl going at it. Cut the crap. You're both starting to sound like a couple of high school kids. At that moment, Sheila came into the bar and sat down beside Bernie. Been here long, she said. No, not long, just a few minutes. But long enough to know I want to move to one of those tables across the room over there so we don't have to listen to the happy trio just behind us. They walked across an inlaid varnished oak dancing floor toward the tables he had mentioned, one of 5 along the street side wall. They sat down for a moment, neither of them said a word. They gazed at one another not with fascination nor pleasure or comfort, but with looks filled with anxiety. This day has been very strange for me, Sheila soon said. Me as well, Bernie said. It's definitely not been a run-of-the-mill day. I have this feeling now because of what happened to Jack, of how precarious life is. Like some hidden danger is always looming just over the horizon. Whatever you do by way of thinking about this horrible thing Jack's undergone, you shouldn't invite those more impossible questions to linger. You've got to shake it off somehow, Sheila. Uncontrollable random events make up a lot of the world. Until you heard the news report yesterday about the shooting, you were simply enjoying each new day, getting your work done, maybe even hooking up with a few friends for some drinks during happy hour. I'm just in a weird place right now, Bernie. I can't help being affected by it. This was too close to home to simply shrug off and ignore, as though nothing had happened. But what you were getting at is also true enough. I can't let Jack having gotten shot and nearly killed overwhelm me, despite my having known him for more than 4 years, almost from the beginning of the time when he first took up the whole comedian thing seriously. He was so determined back then, Bernie. He had this inordinate faith in himself and in the idea he could actually earn a living by getting up in front of an audience or just a bar crowd and telling jokes. We're still about me and Jack back then. He wasn't single yet, so I had that to deal with. But I'd been alone for a long time, Bernie, and I was sick of being alone. Human beings rarely spend their entire lifetimes in solitude, and I sure in hell wasn't